Hey guys, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital. As a lot of you may know already, the A7R IV was just released at the price point of $3,500. This dropped the A7R III, which is still a great camera, down to $2,500. Now the A7 III is at about $2,000, so this puts them at a similar price point. The cameras have very different sensors, different autofocus systems, but today I'd like to compare them and see which camera is right for you and if that $500 difference is big enough to sway you one way or the other. So let's jump in and take a look at sharpness. So pretty obviously the 42 megapixel sensor of the A7R III is going to pull ahead over the 24 megapixel sensor of the A7 III. But just how much and how important is that to you? Let's take a look. Both of these pictures were taken with my Sony Zeiss 50mm 1.4 lens at the base ISO of both cameras, 800 and f5.6, just to really get as much sharpness out of the lens as possible as well. So first let's take a look at these middle points. First thing you can tell is due to the pixel density, going 1:1 does look a bit different between the two images. The A7R III is more zoomed in. We can still pick out some of the major differences if there are any. So first, looking at the middle point, we can see these little imperfections in the construction in both. They both seem pretty sharp. But of course the A7R III, you can see a little bit more of the texture in this area and the texture here. The A7 III is still doing a really great job though. And as we move across the image on both, you can see just how much sharper the A7R III is in capturing the textures of a lot of these areas. Zoomed out though, both images look extremely sharp, but of course the A7R III pulls ahead. Next, let's just do a quick look at dynamic range. I pulled both of these images up by 2 1/3 stops. So let's take a look here at this shadowy bit in the corner. So taking a look at this shadowy bit while pulled up, we can see that they do look pretty similar. The A7R III maintained a little bit more detail along the line and in these cracks and imperfections in this cabinet here. You can also notice that they have similar amounts of noise, but I do see that there is more detail and more accurate color representation in the A7R III. Both have great dynamic range, but I would lean slightly more towards the A7R III for dynamic range. But again, they both do really well here. I think Sony says that they both capture 15 stops of dynamic range. So if either one wins, the A7R III wins by just a hair. So now let's take a look at low light performance. I do like to stay at or under 6400 whenever possible. Most cameras still perform very well at this ISO. Throw in a little bit of noise reduction in post and you can get some really clean images. So we're gonna start at ISO 6400. Again, same settings, both cameras. And on the left, we have the A7 III, and on the right, we have the A7R III. So let's take a look at the middle just to see how both are maintaining sharpness and image quality. The colors are still pretty well represented, and we don't see too much loss of detail yet, even at 6400. The noise in some of these shadowier areas is getting pretty bad on the A7R III, but still definitely usable. It is tighter and cleaner on the A7 III, which is to be expected of lower megapixel cameras. The sensors are the same size, but lower megapixels. The photodiodes are actually bigger, so they capture more light per pixel. So 6400, still really good on both cameras. So now let's jump up to 12,800 on both cameras. Actually really surprised with the quality of the A7 III. I would still say that this is definitely a deliverable, usable picture. Now we're at 12,800 on both cameras, and I'm actually really surprised with the low light performance at this ISO of the A7 III. I would still consider this image on the A7 III deliverable, definitely usable. We still have a lot of sharpness here in the center in the well-lit area. We do see a lot of noise on this black pumpkin when we zoom in 1:1, and as we go towards the edges we see even more. But again, the noise is much tighter and it's really not too unappealing looking. The A7R III, we are starting to get a bit of a color shift towards green in some of these darker areas. The A7R III, it is higher megapixels, so it has more detail to lose. So we're still seeing quite a bit of good detail, but as we go towards the edges, the darker areas of the photo, we do see a lot of this green haze coming in, and it is really starting to fall apart. So let's go right up to 25,000 on both of these cameras, and here you can see the A7R III is getting even more of this green. It's really taken over the shadowier areas. We're really starting to lose some detail, and the overall color shift towards green is starting to get a little unappealing. Between these cameras, I can also start to notice that even though they're at the exact same settings, the A7R III is overall darker. The A7 III is holding up pretty well. We're losing a little bit of detail, but the detail is still pretty sharp. We have a tiny bit of that green haze creeping in some of these areas, but it's really not too bad. And the tighter noise is definitely more appealing. So now let's go ahead and hit 51,000. This is definitely getting to the outer range of usability. The A7R III is completely been overtaken by this green haze, color shift in the darker areas. We're losing a lot of detail, starting to get very muddy looking. The A7 III again is really pulling ahead. It's really showing Sony's really flexing here their ability to create these. Both have backlit sensors, but again, I really think it's these the larger photodiodes give us this tighter noise and overall more light capture. Yeah, the A7R III is definitely falling apart, and the A7 III is still, I don't know that I would consider this usable for most clients, but if you do have to go up to this higher range, for whatever reason, the A7 III is definitely pulling ahead. So moving along into the extended range, here we have ISO 100,000, and I would definitely say this is falling apart on both of these images. Again, the A7R III is noticeably darker, even though all the settings are exactly the same between the two. Both images, we've lost a lot of detail. Even with the higher megapixels of the A7R III, we are getting more detail from the A7 III. A lot of the textures on the inside of these jack-o'-lanterns are being maintained a lot better by the A7R III. But again, more of the same. We've got this green cast, very unattractive in the A7R III, and we have much less of that, although it is really starting to come in on the A7 III. Then finally on the A7 III, the extended range goes all the way up to 204,000, which is one stop past the A7R III. So in post, I added a stop. Here, it's even more noticeably darker. We've got a green cast on both. The green cast on the A7R III is much worse. If I just try to eyeball it and maybe add another half stop to match the exposures, then the A7R III is completely fallen apart. It's looking really bad. The noise, we've got color noise and luminance noise. The A7 III is definitely falling apart also, but the noise is tighter and overall does still look better. But yeah, on both cameras, I would consider this pretty much unusable unless for whatever reason you absolutely had to. So just a quick recap, we compared sharpness, dynamic range, and low light performance. The clear winner for sharpness is the A7R III with almost 20 megapixels more than the A7 III. Pretty obvious, but for a lot of purposes, web viewing, Instagram, smaller prints, you're really not going to notice that much of a difference. 24 megapixels is a good place to be. If you do need that extra detail, you want to crop, you want the flexibility to crop, or you want to make large prints, I would definitely go with the A7R III. Dynamic range, very comparable. I didn't do a very comprehensive test, but for most purposes, I think that they're very similar. And if one does inch ahead just a little bit, I would give it to the A7R III. We got more detail, better color. And then finally, low light, the A7 III, larger photodiodes on the same size sensors, so we do get more total light gathered per pixel. So I would give the A7 III the advantage in low light. So stay tuned, we're going to do more comparisons between these two cameras. Please check out the links below if you're interested in either of these cameras, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks.